At 6:42 a.m. on July 30th, 1942, Captain Howard Paquin pressed against the cold metal framing of his North American B-25 Mitchell and watched something that should have been impossible to witness without fury. He watched as bombs fall. They fell and fell, drifting sideways in the upper winds, sliding across the sky like leaves dropped from a second-story window. Then they struck the ocean in a neat line of white geysers, close enough to drench the deck of the Japanese transport below, far enough away to leave everyone aboard completely alive. The ship never changed speed. It never altered course. It continued on as if the attack had been nothing more than a passing rain shower. This was not a story about sloppy aim or poor discipline. Paquin's crew had followed doctrine precisely, executing the manual with the calm efficiency of men who had rehearsed every step until it was muscle memory. And they achieved the same result American bomber crews have been producing across the Pacific since the early months of the war. Impressive near misses that accomplished absolutely nothing. The problem lived inside a number. 20,000. That was the altitude American bombing doctrine prescribed for attacking enemy shipping. On paper, it sounded safe and rational. In practice, it was catastrophically wrong for moving targets. A bomb dropped from 20,000 feet does not fall straight down. It travels in a long, arcing path that takes roughly 30 seconds from release to impact. And in 30 seconds, a ship's captain with one hand on the engine telegraph can order a turn that shifts his vessel hundreds of feet from the aim point. The bomb cannot adjust. It falls to where the ship used to be and detonates in empty water. 30 seconds sounds brief, until you are standing on the bridge of a Japanese transport in the Bismarck Sea, watching a formation of B-25s at altitude. Then 30 seconds is eternity. Enough time to issue a clear order. Enough time to see the rudder swing and the bow begin to carve a new heading. Enough time to step aside from the spot where death had been aimed. By mid-1942, Japanese convoy captains had internalized this arithmetic. High-altitude bombers were noise, spectacle, expensive splashes. Geography made the failure dangerous. The Vitiaz Strait, a protected corridor between New Britain and New Guinea, had become a resupply highway. Japanese convoys moved through it with growing confidence, carrying troops, artillery, ammunition, everything required to reinforce their grip on northeastern New Guinea. Those soldiers would disembark, march inland, and dig into jungle positions to fight American and Australian forces clawing up beaches and through mountains in conditions that made the word difficult sound absurd. And overhead, B-25 crews burned fuel and endured anti-aircraft fire at 20,000 feet, watching convoys arrive intact. Their bomb patterns decorated the sea like a costly and utterly useless art installation. Dramatic from a distance, meaningless on impact. The 5th Air Force was bleeding for nothing, and everyone knew it. From crew chiefs to staff officers, the evidence was visible in gun camera footage filled with beautiful splashes and intact enemy ships. The institutional response was predictable. The doctrine was not wrong. Its execution was. Crews needed more practice. Bombardiers needed better calibration. The solution to missing ships from 20,000 feet, they argued, was to become more proficient at bombing from 20,000 feet. It was a tidy explanation, so long as the ships cooperated by holding still. Into that expensive stalemate stepped Major William Robert Benn, AB-25 pilot, who looked at the problem directly instead of consulting the manual. What he saw was not a training deficiency, but a geometry error. Bombs drifted because they fell too far. Ships escaped because they had too much time. Eliminate the distance. Eliminate the problem. Bring the bomber down from 20,000 feet to 50. Fly low enough that wind drift becomes negligible and maneuver time shrinks to seconds. Release the bomb at a shallow angle so it skips across the water like a stone, striking a hull at or below the waterline, where armor is thin and flooding is fatal. The reaction from senior officers was immediate and unified. The word they chose was not premature or unproven. It was suicide. A North American B-25 Mitchell at 50 feet over a Japanese convoy was not a bomber on an attack run. It was a large, slow target flying directly into concentrated anti-aircraft fire. At that altitude, gunners did not need complex calculations. They pointed and shot. The pilot could see muzzle flashes racing toward him. There was also the fuse problem. Without the correct delay, a bomb skipping into a ship's side could detonate before the aircraft cleared the blast. Every objection was technically accurate. None of them changed the fact that the existing method was failing. Benn understood the risks better than the officers listing them, because he intended to fly the mission himself. He was not arguing for recklessness. He was arguing for precision, and that distinction was about to reshape air combat in the Southwest Pacific. The permission he received from George C. Kenny was quiet and conditional, not a formal directive, but a nod born of desperation. Kenny had watched mission after mission return with near misses, while Japanese convoys continued unloading at Lae. The men fighting through New Guinea's jungles were paying for doctrinal rigidity in blood. If the experiment failed, the accountability would be swift and personal. Benn accepted the terms. He gathered crews willing to try what others called madness and flew north to Port Moresby to practice over open water. The target was a stripped hulk anchored in the shallows. The bombs were concrete-filled dummies designed to mark impact without exploding. What followed could not be taught in a lecture hall. It existed in the space between a pilot's grip on the controls and the sea rushing past 50 feet below the fuselage. They learned how low 50 feet truly was. They learned how quickly water rises toward you when you descend too far. They learned the exact sight picture required to release at the right instant. So the bomb would strike, skip, and slam into steel instead of burying itself harmlessly in the surf. It was not recklessness. It was rehearsal, measured, repeated, refined, and soon it would move from practice hulks to live convoys. It was a realm where variables were felt, not calculated, where mistakes were measured in feet, not percentages on an accuracy chart. The early attempts revealed how razor-thin the margins were. A 500-pound bomb dropped at 250 miles per hour from 50 feet did not behave like one released from altitude. It skipped. It struck the water like a flat stone, ricocheting forward in violent arcs. The difference between 2 skips, impacting perfectly at the waterline, and 3 skips, sailing uselessly over the deck, was measured in single-digit miles per hour and a handful of yards. Too fast, it overshot. Too slow, it sank short. A pilot who tried to calculate those margins consciously was already too late. Skip bombing had to become instinct. A North American B, 25 Mitchell had to hold roughly 250 miles per hour during the entire approach, 50 feet above open water. The altimeter was useless at that height. Too slow, too imprecise. Altitude was judged by eye, by the narrowing strip of sea beneath the fuselage, wind, chop, glare, and the knowledge that enemy gunners would open fire as soon as the aircraft cleared mast height all conspired to disrupt that judgment. Release distance, 200 to 250 yards, could not be read from an instrument. At 250 miles per hour, the time between 200 yards and 100 yards was less than a second. Crews learned to judge it by the apparent size of the ship in the windscreen. Skip bombing was not a checklist procedure. It was muscle memory, like a carpenter knowing a nail is set by feel and sound. Except the carpenter was moving at 250 miles per hour, and the nail weighed half a ton. The fuse problem, the most legitimate objection from headquarters, found its solution in the hands of Paul I. Gunn, known throughout the 5th Air Force as Pappy Gunn. He approached bombs the way a mechanic approaches an engine: disassemble, understand, modify. Gunn determined existing fuses could be altered to provide a 4 to 5 second delay between impact and detonation. At 250 miles per hour, that delay allowed the B-25 to travel roughly 1,500 feet, far enough to clear the blast before the bomb detonated inside the target's hull. The airplane itself required transformation. The Bombardier Station and its Norden bomb sight, designed for high-altitude precision, were removed from the nose. At 50 feet, they were dead weight. In their place, Gunn installed a package of forward-firing .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns. 4, sometimes 8, turned the B-25's nose into a gun platform. The logic was simple. At mast height, shipboard gunners could see the bomber clearly and aim with ease. But men under concentrated machine gun fire struggle to maintain composure. The nose gun suppressed the deck crews, forcing them to take cover during the crucial seconds of the approach run. Live fire practice against anchor hulks confirmed what the theory promised. Bombs struck holes at the waterline. Delayed fuses detonated after the aircraft cleared. Nose guns kept imaginary gunners pinned. The pieces meshed with clarity that felt inevitable in hindsight. It had not required new mathematics. It had required proximity, flying close enough to problem to see it honestly, and daring enough to solve it at 50 feet above the sea. In late February 1943, Japanese commanders at Rabaul assembled a convoy they believed was protected by proven mathematics. 8 troop transports, 8 destroyers, roughly 7,000 soldiers, fighter cover overhead, and a year's worth of Allied bombing statistics suggesting safety from 20,000 feet. The destination was La. The route ran through the Bismarck Sea, waters where high-altitude bombing had repeatedly failed to stop moving ships. The arithmetic appeared sound. It was not. The convoy that sailed on February 28th was the most ambitious reinforcement effort in the Southwest Pacific since Guadalcanal. Japanese planners calculated escort strength, air cover, geography, and past Allied inaccuracy. Every variable pointed toward success. What they had not calculated was a North American B. 25 Mitchell flying at 50 feet with a pilot who had practiced a single maneuver until it required no conscious thought. On March 2, 1943, the battle opened conventionally. High-altitude Allied bombers attacked first and achieved what such attacks usually achieved, near misses and one damaging but non-fatal hit on a transport. The convoy altered formation and pressed on. Japanese destroyer captains watched the splash patterns with professional satisfaction. The numbers still favored them. At 0900 on March 3rd, the numbers changed. The skip bombers approached from the northeast at wave-top height. Throttled to 250 miles per hour, they held 50 feet above the sea, low enough that spray was visible from the cockpit windows. At that altitude, a fully loaded Mitchell left no margin for error. The difference between controlled flight and catastrophic impact was measured in inches. Japanese gunners sighted the incoming aircraft at almost the exact moment the bomber's forward-firing M2 Browning machine guns opened fire. The effect was unlike anything they had experienced. Fire was not descending from altitude. It was sweeping horizontally across decks and bridges. Gun crews attempting to track the aircraft found themselves under direct, concentrated fire. Positions meant for engaging enemies became the most exposed spots on the ship. Some gunners stayed and were cut down. Others dove for cover. Either way, the last 200 yards of the approach run were far less lethal than doctrine had predicted. The lead B, 25 crossed the bow of the first transport at mast height and released at approximately 230 yards, the distance established in months of practice. The 500-pound bomb struck the water, skipped once, skipped twice, and slammed into the hull of the waterline. The 4-second delay fuse began its count. Inside the transport, the detonation tore outward through steel and flesh with equal indifference. The blast lifted the ship, ruptured compartments, and converted buoyancy into flooding in a single violent instant. And in that moment, the protective arithmetic that had guarded Japanese convoys since the beginning of the war ceased to apply. A 500-pound bomb exploding beside a ship is an inconvenience of physics. A 500-pound bomb exploding inside a ship is a verdict. A near miss from altitude throws its energy into water. The sea absorbs, disperses, cushions. Hull plates flex. Rivets strain. Compartments leak. Damage control teams fight and often win. The ship survives. But a contact detonation at the waterline transfers its energy directly into steel at the point of greatest vulnerability. It punches inward, then outward, opening the hull precisely where the ocean is most patient and most unstoppable. Water does not panic. It simply enters and keeps entering. The North American B, 25 Mitchell that released the first bomb was already climbing away when the 4-second delay expired. The modification devised by Paul I. Gunn worked exactly as intended. The aircraft had covered the necessary distance before 500 pounds of trinitrotoluene detonated inside the transport's hull. The pilot did not need to look back. The pressure wave shuddered through the airframe. a tactile confirmation that geometry and timing had aligned, and that the ship behind him now faced a problem beyond repair. For 22 minutes, the attack unfolded with a precision of repetition turned into instinct. Each B-25 found its angle, its airspeed, its release point. Bombs struck hulls, not water. The difference was visible from every cockpit. Ships hit internally at the waterline do not maintain formation. They slow, they list, they settle by bow or stern depending on where flooding winds first. Smoke thickens. Speed bleeds away. The destroyers meant to shield the convoy maneuvered violently to avoid incoming aircraft, hauled survivors from oil-slicked water, and did everything except preserve the transports long enough to reach La. By the afternoon of March 4th, the arithmetic required no interpretation. Of the 8 troop ships that had departed Rabaul on February 28th, none remained operational, for the 8 escorting destroyers were sunk. Thousands of soldiers were dead or stranded in the Bismarck Sea as Allied aircraft suppressed organized rescue efforts. The high-altitude bombers had opened the battle on March 2nd with familiar patterns of near misses. The skip bombers closed it by March 4th with results so far outside previous experience that staff officers at 5th Air Force Headquarters reread their after-action reports to ensure they were not miscalculating. In 3 days, low-level skip bombing accomplished what a year of high-altitude attempts had failed to achieve. The mathematics of the Bismarck Sea had been rewritten at mass height and 250 miles per hour by men once told their idea was suicide, and who concluded that the greater danger lay in continuing to miss from 20,000 feet. When the last Japanese ship slipped beneath the surface, the silence that followed was not emptiness. It was conclusion. 8 troop ships had sailed. 8 would never reach La. That number, 8, did not fade when the smoke cleared. It settled over every subsequent Japanese decision about moving men and supplies north of New Guinea with a permanence no directive could match. There is no rebuttal to arithmetic that absolute. In his after-action report to Douglas MacArthur, George C. Kennedy described the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in careful, measured language because the results required careful, measured language. 3 days of fighting. 8 troop ships sunk, 4 of 8 destroyers destroyed, thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors dead, and, most significantly, the effective closure of the sea route between Rabaul and La as a viable daylight resupply corridor. The decisive instrument had not been the high-altitude bombers that opened the battle. It had been the low-level North American B-25 Mitchell aircraft that closed it, flying at 50 feet, armed with forward-firing M2 Browning guns and delayed-fuse 500-pound bombs that entered hulls rather than exploding beside them. Kenny understood the difference between those outcomes. He also understood that the difference traced back to a pilot willing to stand close enough to the problem to see it clearly. Institutional conversion followed. Not loudly, not immediately, but completely. Training schedules across 5th Air Force bases in New Guinea and Australia began allocating hours to low-level over-water attack profiles. Maintenance orders redirected B-25s from high-altitude configuration to nose gun packages. The word suicide disappeared from memoranda, replaced with a more bureaucratic phrase low-altitude skip bombing technique. The military's preferred way of acknowledging that a man once labeled reckless had been correct. The Japanese response proved even more decisive than Allied planners had anticipated. Rather than simply adjusting escort strength or refining anti-aircraft doctrine, Japanese commanders curtailed major daylight convoy operations to the New Guinea coast altogether. They shifted to night barge traffic and submarine resupply, methods capable of moving only a fraction of the manpower and material that surface convoys had once delivered. A ceiling descended on Japanese reinforcement capacity in New Guinea. Over the next 2 years, Allied ground forces would push steadily upward against that limit. The ceiling had not been imposed by blockade alone or by abstract strategic theory. It had been installed at mass height and 250 miles per hour. For his role in developing and executing the method, the architect of skip bombing received the Distinguished Service Cross, a formal acknowledgement of innovation and courage. But the larger recognition was quieter and more enduring. The mathematics of the Southwest Pacific had changed, and every convoy commander thereafter knew it. He accepted the decoration with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had never needed a medal to confirm the work was right. after the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. He kept flying, kept refining, kept applying solution with the steady competence of someone who had already answered the only question that mattered. When the war ended, his life assumed the outward shape common to many men who altered the course of the Pacific Air War: family, career, routine. Nothing in the ordinary cadence of post-war days suggested that he had once flown a North American B, 25 Mitchell at 50 feet toward the largest Japanese convoy in the Southwest Pacific, and demonstrated that precision, not recklessness, was a decisive factor. He did not spend years explaining that distinction. It had already been written into the Bismarck Sea, in the form of 8 troop ships and 4 destroyers that never completed their voyage from Rabaul to La. Results are a language that require little translation. The maintenance genius who made the geometry survivable, Paul Pappy Gunn, did not live to see the long arc of his influence. He died in a plane crash in the Philippines in 1957. Yet the practical modifications he devised in rough New Guinea workshops, the delayed fuses, the forward-firing M2 Browning insulations, echoed forward into attack aircraft doctrine for a generation. The principle that a low-flying aircraft requires its own suppressive fire during the attack run became embedded in anti-shipping and ground attack design philosophy. That kind of legacy rarely comes with ceremony. It appears instead in assumptions, design choices future engineers make, without realizing whose field improvisation first proved them necessary. We remember these stories, so the man who challenged a failing doctrine does not dissolve into abstraction. He saw that the existing method was costing lives without producing results. He stood close enough to the problem to see the flaw clearly, and then he flew low enough to correct it. Long after the last B-25 rests in a museum and the sea has closed over the wreckage, the lesson remains. Sometimes the difference between suicide and precision is not altitude, but understanding.